Tonight, we are stepping far back in time to a world that existed thousands of years before written history, before clocks, before modern cities, to a place shaped by rivers, seasons, and quiet human routine. This is the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the earliest urban societies ever formed, where daily life moved slowly and predictably, guided by habit rather than urgency. There are no battles to follow here, no heroes to remember, and no dramatic events to keep track of. Instead, this is a calm journey through ordinary days, simple work, and steady rhythms that repeated themselves over generations. As we explore how people lived, worked, rested, and moved through their environment, you do not need to remember names or dates, and you do not need to stay awake. Let the details drift past gently, like the flow of the river itself, as this quiet history unfolds at its own unhurried pace, allowing your mind to slow, your thoughts to soften, and rest to arrive naturally.
The Indus Valley Civilization developed gradually over thousands of years in the region surrounding the Indus River and its tributaries in what is now modern-day Pakistan and parts of northwest India, and it existed quietly alongside the natural rhythms of the land. Rather than forming suddenly, the civilization grew slowly as small farming communities expanded, settled, and became more organized over time. The people who lived in the Indus Valley relied heavily on the river system, which provided water for drinking, farming, and transportation, and the regular flooding of the river created fertile soil that supported agriculture year after year. Daily life followed a steady and predictable pattern shaped by the seasons, the availability of water, and the needs of the community. As villages grew into larger towns and cities, people began to live in carefully planned urban spaces such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, where streets were laid out in straight lines and intersected at right angles, creating a sense of order and consistency throughout the city. Buildings were constructed primarily from standardized baked bricks, suggesting that construction followed shared methods and measurements, repeated across neighborhoods without significant variation. Most homes were modest in size and built close together, often featuring inner courtyards that allowed light and air to circulate while maintaining privacy. These courtyards likely served as quiet centers of domestic life, where daily activities such as cooking, washing, and resting took place. Many houses included private wells and bathing areas, indicating that access to water and regular washing were common parts of everyday routines, rather than special or ceremonial practices. Wastewater flowed through covered drainage systems built along the streets, quietly carrying water away from homes and public spaces in a continuous and unnoticed process. The presence of these drainage systems suggests that daily life included ongoing maintenance and shared responsibility, with people accustomed to living in clean, organized environments. Most individuals likely spent their days engaged in practical tasks such as farming nearby fields, tending animals, producing tools, or preparing food, repeating similar motions and responsibilities each day. Farming followed a slow and cyclical rhythm, with crops planted, tended, harvested, and stored according to seasonal patterns that changed very little from one year to the next. Wheat and barley were common crops, and cotton was grown and used to produce simple clothing suitable for the warm climate. Food preparation was straightforward and consistent, involving grinding grains into flour, cooking meals over open fires, and eating within family groups in quiet domestic spaces. Social interactions were likely calm and routine, centered around shared work, family life, and community cooperation, rather than displays of power or wealth. There is little evidence of large palaces, dramatic monuments, or royal tombs, suggesting that life was relatively even and stable, without extreme social divisions dominating daily experience. Trade existed as a regular but unhurried activity, with goods such as pottery, beads, and tools exchanged locally or transported slowly to distant regions, following established routes that changed little over time. Children likely learned by observing adults, gradually taking on simple tasks and responsibilities, growing into the same routines that had guided generations before them. As days passed in the Indus Valley, life continued in this steady and organized manner, shaped by repetition, environment, and shared practices, with no clear beginning or end to any single day. And this quiet continuity extended forward, forming the foundation of daily living that would continue to unfold further. As life continued in the Indus Valley, most people experienced their days through steady routines shaped by work, food preparation, and household responsibilities, repeating familiar patterns that changed very little over time. Many individuals likely began their mornings early, as daylight and temperature influenced daily activity, especially in an environment where artificial lighting was limited. Agricultural work remained central to survival, with farmers tending nearby fields, maintaining irrigation channels, and caring for animals, such as cattle, sheep, and goats, all of which played a practical role in food production and transport. These tasks followed predictable seasonal cycles, with planting, tending, harvesting, and storage occurring in the same order year after year. Within the cities themselves, others focused on skilled labor, producing pottery, tools, beads, seals, and textiles, often working in small, quiet spaces where the same motions were repeated carefully each day. Pottery was shaped, fired, and stored using consistent methods, creating vessels that were practical rather than decorative, designed for storage, cooking, and transport. Bead making required patience and precision, as small stones were drilled, polished, and strung, a process that took time and attention but involved little variation once the technique was learned. Food preparation followed a similarly repetitive rhythm, with grains ground into flour using stone tools, meals cooked over simple hearths, and food shared among family members within the home. Diets were likely based on grains, legumes, vegetables, and occasional meat, depending on availability. And meals were practical rather than elaborate, designed to sustain rather than impress. Water remained central to daily life, as people regularly drew it from wells or public sources, using it for drinking, cooking, washing, and cleaning, integrating water use seamlessly into routine activities. Bathing appears to have been a common practice, carried out in private or shared spaces, reinforcing habits of cleanliness that were woven quietly into everyday life. Clothing was simple and functional, likely made from cotton or wool, worn loosely to suit the climate and daily labor. Social interaction occurred naturally through shared work, family life, and neighborhood proximity, rather than through large public gatherings or formal ceremonies. There is little evidence of sudden disruptions or dramatic events shaping daily experience, suggesting that most days passed quietly, marked more by repetition than by change. Children likely spent their early years observing adults, gradually learning skills through imitation, and slowly taking on responsibilities as they grew older, continuing the same routines practiced by generations before them. As evenings arrived, work slowed, temperatures cooled, and households settled into quieter moments, preparing food, resting, and sleeping within the steady order of the city, while life in the Indus Valley continued forward in the same calm and structured way, gradually unfolding without urgency. As daily routines continued within the Indus Valley cities, much of life unfolded quietly inside homes and neighborhoods, shaped by consistency, familiarity, and shared space rather than by dramatic events. Residential areas were arranged in an orderly way, with houses built close together along straight streets, creating neighborhoods where people lived near one another for long periods of time. Homes were generally constructed from the same baked bricks used throughout the city, giving the environment a uniform appearance that changed very little from one household to the next. Most houses followed similar layouts, often centered around an inner courtyard that provided light, ventilation, and a private outdoor space where daily tasks could be carried out calmly. These courtyards likely served as the quiet heart of the home, where food was prepared, Tools were stored, and family members spent time resting or working on simple tasks. The interiors of houses were practical rather than decorative, with rooms used for sleeping, storage, and daily activities. Furniture was likely minimal, consisting of mats, low platforms, and containers for food and water. Many homes included stairways leading to upper levels or rooftops, which may have been used for storage, drying food, or resting during cooler parts of the day. Water access remained a constant part of household life, as private wells or nearby public wells allowed residents to collect water regularly.
Integrating this task naturally into daily routines, neighborhood life appears to have been quiet and cooperative, with people sharing streets, wells, and drainage systems, all of which required regular attention and maintenance to function smoothly. There is little evidence of large public gathering spaces designed for entertainment or spectacle, suggesting that social life was informal and woven gently into everyday interactions rather than organized around major events. Neighbors likely encountered one another while collecting water, preparing food, or moving through the streets, engaging in simple conversations related to daily work and household needs. Religious or spiritual practices, if present, seem to have been subtle and personal, reflected in small figurines, seals, or symbols, rather than large temples or ceremonial centers, indicating that belief was likely integrated quietly into domestic life. Children growing up in these neighborhoods would have become familiar with the same streets, buildings, and routines from an early age, learning through observation and repetition rather than formal instruction. As days passed, the environment around them remained largely unchanged, reinforcing a sense of stability and continuity. Even as generations came and went, the physical structure of the city and the rhythms of neighborhood life stayed consistent, allowing daily living in the Indus Valley to continue in a calm, orderly manner, gradually unfolding forward without interruption.
Water played a constant and practical role in everyday life throughout the Indus Valley Civilization, shaping routines in ways that were steady, predictable, and quietly maintained over long periods of time. Cities were carefully designed to manage water efficiently, and this design influenced how people moved through their environment each day. Wells were common features within neighborhoods and even inside individual homes, allowing residents to collect water regularly without traveling far, making the task of gathering water a familiar and repeated part of daily routine. This water was used for drinking, cooking, washing, and cleaning, integrating cleanliness naturally into everyday life rather than reserving it for special occasions. One of the most notable features of Indus Valley cities was their drainage system, which ran beneath streets and alongside buildings, carrying wastewater away through covered channels that functioned quietly and continuously. These drains were carefully constructed from brick and often included access points for maintenance, suggesting that people were accustomed to keeping them clear and functional as part of shared responsibility. Bathing appears to have been a regular practice, with many homes including bathing areas where water could be poured over the body and drained away efficiently, reinforcing habits of cleanliness that were repeated day after day. Larger public bathing structures, such as the Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, suggest that water also had communal importance, though its use likely remained calm and orderly rather than ceremonial or dramatic. The consistent presence of water systems indicates that life in the Indus Valley depended on planning, cooperation, and routine upkeep, all of which required patience rather than urgency. Streets remained relatively clean due to the drainage infrastructure, and waste disposal followed established patterns that changed little over time. The predictable movement of water through the city mirrored the predictable movement of daily life itself, flowing steadily without interruption. Residents likely grew accustomed to these systems from childhood, learning how to use, maintain, and respect them through observation and repetition.
Over time, the reliability of water access and sanitation contributed to a stable living environment where daily tasks could proceed without disruption, allowing life in the Indus Valley to continue in its characteristic calm and structured manner, gradually extending forward as part of the ongoing rhythm of everyday existence. Trade and exchange formed a steady but unhurried part of daily life in the Indus Valley Civilization, operating quietly alongside farming, craft production, and household routines. People produced goods primarily for practical use, but excess items were regularly exchanged within cities and with nearby regions, following established patterns that remained consistent over long periods of time. Artisans created pottery, tools, beads, seals, and textiles using familiar techniques that emphasized uniformity rather than decoration, and these items were traded locally through calm, routine interactions rather than through large marketplaces or dramatic negotiations. Seals made from stone, often carved with simple symbols or animals, were likely used to mark goods and identify ownership, suggesting an organized system of trade that functioned smoothly without constant oversight. Some goods traveled beyond the Indus Valley itself, reaching distant regions such as Mesopotamia, though this exchange occurred slowly, following river routes or overland paths that changed very little over time. Boats likely moved goods along rivers at an unhurried pace, while caravans transported items across land. Stopping regularly and following the same routes generation after generation, travel for trade purposes was practical rather than adventurous, focused on moving familiar goods between familiar locations. Within cities, storage spaces were used to hold grain, tools, and trade items, allowing households and workshops to manage supplies gradually rather than in response to sudden demand. Weights and measures appear to have been standardized, suggesting that people were accustomed to consistent units of value, reinforcing fairness and predictability in exchange. Economic life did not seem driven by wealth accumulation or display, as there is little evidence of large merchant estates or extravagant residences. Instead, trade supported stability, ensuring that households had access to necessary materials while maintaining balance within the community. Children growing up in this environment would have observed trade as a normal part of life, learning through repetition how goods were produced, measured, stored, and exchanged. As days passed, trade continued quietly in the background of daily routines, neither expanding rapidly nor disappearing, simply extending forward as another steady thread woven into the calm and organized fabric of life in the Indus Valley. Alongside farming and trade, much of daily life in the Indus Valley Civilization involved skilled but repetitive craftsmanship carried out quietly within homes, workshops, and shared neighborhood spaces. People produced tools and household items using materials that were readily available, such as stone, clay, copper, and bronze, relying on established techniques that were passed down through observation and practice rather than formal instruction. Stone tools were shaped carefully for cutting, grinding, and construction, with the same forms repeated again and again to meet familiar needs. Metalworking involved melting and shaping copper and bronze to create simple tools, ornaments, and utensils, a process that required patience, steady heat, and careful timing rather than speed or innovation. Pottery production followed a similarly consistent rhythm, with clay collected, shaped on simple wheels, dried, fired, and stored, producing vessels that were practical, uniform, and widely used throughout the civilization. These pots served everyday purposes, such as cooking, storage, and transport, and their designs remained largely unchanged over long periods, reinforcing a sense of continuity. Bead making was another common craft, involving the slow drilling, polishing, and shaping of small stones, shells, or metals, tasks that required focus but little variation once learned. Many artisans likely worked close to their homes, integrating craft production naturally into daily life, rather than separating work from domestic space.
Tools and craft items were produced steadily rather than in large quantities, allowing people to balance skilled labor with other responsibilities, such as farming, food preparation, and household maintenance. Children growing up in these environments would have observed these activities daily, gradually learning through repetition how materials were handled and transformed. The absence of elaborate decoration or dramatic artistic expression suggests that craftsmanship emphasized function and reliability rather than display. Over time, these repeated acts of making and repairing tools helped maintain the steady rhythm of daily life, quietly supporting the broader structure of Indus Valley society as days continued to pass in an orderly and familiar way.
Clothing and personal appearance in the Indus Valley Civilization appear to have been practical, simple, and closely connected to daily work and climate rather than to fashion or display. Most people likely wore garments made from cotton, which was grown, spun, and woven locally, making it widely available and well-suited to the warm environment. Wool may also have been used in cooler seasons or regions, though cotton seems to have been the primary material for everyday clothing. Garments were probably loose and comfortable, allowing for ease of movement during farming, craft work, and household tasks, and styles likely changed very little over time. There is little evidence of complex tailoring or layered clothing, suggesting that people valued functionality and repetition over variation. Personal items such as beads, bangles, and simple ornaments were commonly worn, though these items were modest in size and design, reflecting routine habits rather than ceremonial use. Beads made from stone, shell, or metal were often strung together and worn as necklaces or bracelets, and their production followed the same careful, repetitive processes used in other crafts. Seals, which are frequently found in archaeological sites, may have served both practical and symbolic purposes, possibly worn or carried as personal identifiers in daily activities. Grooming habits were likely simple and regular, with people maintaining their appearance through washing and basic care rather than elaborate decoration. Hairstyles may have been kept short or tied back for convenience, especially during work, and personal cleanliness was supported by regular access to water in bathing spaces. These everyday choices around clothing and appearance blended naturally into daily routines, reinforcing a sense of consistency and familiarity. Over time, the way people dressed and presented themselves became part of the steady visual rhythm of the cities, with individuals looking much the same from one day to the next, as life in the Indus Valley continued forward quietly, shaped by repetition, comfort, and practicality. Family life in the Indus Valley Civilization likely followed calm and familiar patterns, shaped by shared spaces, routine responsibilities, and long-established traditions passed quietly from one generation to the next. Households were often multi-generational, with parents, children, and older relatives living together or close by, allowing daily life to unfold in a steady and predictable way. Children grew up surrounded by the same streets, courtyards, and neighborhood sounds, becoming familiar with their environment from an early age. Learning was informal and gradual, taking place through observation rather than instruction, as children watched adults farm fields, prepare food, shape tools, or manage household tasks. Over time, they would begin to assist with simple responsibilities, slowly repeating the same actions until they became routine. There is little evidence of formal schooling or structured education, suggesting that knowledge was transmitted quietly through daily participation rather than organized teaching. Family roles were likely clearly understood, shaped by age, experience, and physical ability, allowing households to function smoothly without constant adjustment. Evenings may have been spent resting within the home, sharing meals, repairing tools, or simply remaining together in quiet domestic spaces. Elder members of the household likely carried memories of past seasons and long-standing practices, reinforcing continuity and stability through their presence. Birth, growth, aging, and death occurred within the same familiar environments, with each generation experiencing life in much the same way as those before them.
Over long periods of time, this repetition created a sense of permanence where daily life changed very little from year to year. As families continued to live, work, and rest together within the ordered structure of the city, the rhythm of domestic life remained steady, forming another quiet layer of continuity that carried life in the Indus Valley calmly forward. Food storage and preparation in the Indus Valley Civilization followed steady, repetitive routines that fit naturally into daily life, shaped by practicality rather than variety or excess. After crops such as wheat and barley were harvested, grains were dried and stored in containers or storage areas within homes, allowing families to manage their food supplies gradually over time. Storage jars and bins were designed for long-term use, helping protect food from moisture and pests, and these containers were used in much the same way year after year. Cooking was likely done using simple hearths fueled by wood or dried plant material, with meals prepared slowly and predictably according to familiar methods. Grains were ground into flour using stone tools, a task that required time and repetition, often performed daily as part of household routine. Meals were simple and nourishing, consisting mainly of grains, legumes, vegetables, and occasionally meat, depending on availability and season. Food was cooked in practical pottery vessels and shared among family members in quiet domestic spaces, without elaborate ceremony or decoration. Eating likely followed a regular schedule, shaped by daylight and work patterns, allowing households to settle into consistent rhythms. Leftover food may have been stored carefully for later use, reinforcing habits of planning and moderation. Children growing up in these households would have observed food preparation from an early age, gradually learning how ingredients were handled, cooked, and stored through repetition rather than instruction. The act of preparing and sharing meals became a familiar anchor within daily life, marking the passage of time in small, predictable ways. As days continued to pass in the Indus Valley, food-related routines remained steady and unchanged, quietly supporting the ongoing rhythm of life as households moved calmly from one meal to the next. Beliefs and spiritual practices in the Indus Valley Civilization appear to have been subtle and woven gently into everyday life rather than expressed through large temples, dramatic rituals, or public ceremonies. Archaeological evidence suggests that religious or symbolic ideas were likely practiced privately within homes or small community spaces, allowing belief to remain calm and personal. Small figurines, seals, and symbolic carvings have been found throughout Indus Valley sites, often depicting animals, human figures, or abstract symbols, though their exact meanings remain unclear. These objects were likely familiar parts of daily surroundings, handled regularly rather than treated as rare or sacred items. There is little evidence of organized priesthoods or centralized religious authority, suggesting that spiritual life did not dominate daily routines, but instead existed quietly alongside work, family life, and household responsibilities. Rituals, if practiced, were likely simple and repetitive, following established patterns that changed very little over time. Symbols carved onto seals may have served both practical and symbolic purposes, marking ownership while also carrying cultural meaning understood within the community. The absence of large religious structures indicates that belief did not require grand spaces or gatherings, reinforcing the idea that spirituality was integrated calmly into ordinary life. People may have offered quiet respect to natural elements such as water, animals, or fertility, reflecting their dependence on the environment for survival. Children growing up in this society would have become familiar with these symbols gradually, learning their significance through observation rather than instruction. Over time, spiritual practices became another steady thread within daily existence, neither demanding attention nor causing disruption, allowing life in the Indus Valley to continue forward in a balanced and unhurried way. Governance in the Indus Valley Civilization appears to have been calm, organized, and largely invisible in daily life,
with little evidence of rulers displaying power through monuments, inscriptions, or grand architecture. Unlike other ancient civilizations, there are no clear signs of kings, royal palaces, or large statues celebrating individual leaders, suggesting that authority was exercised quietly through shared systems rather than through public displays. The consistent layout of cities, standardized brick sizes, and uniform planning across large regions indicate that decisions were made collectively or through administrative processes that emphasized order and cooperation. Rules and expectations were likely well understood and followed through habit rather than enforcement, allowing daily life to proceed without frequent conflict or disruption. The maintenance of streets, drainage systems, and public spaces would have required coordination, suggesting the presence of organized civic responsibility carried out steadily over time. Disputes, if they occurred, were likely resolved locally through discussion or shared norms rather than formal courts or dramatic punishment. The absence of fortifications or large military structures implies that defense and warfare were not central concerns for most people, reinforcing a sense of internal stability. Standardized weights and measures used in trade point to agreed-upon systems that helped maintain fairness and predictability in economic life. Children growing up in this environment would have absorbed these expectations naturally, learning how to behave, cooperate, and participate simply by observing those around them. Over long periods, this quiet form of governance allowed communities to function smoothly without drawing attention to authority, enabling life in the Indus Valley to continue forward in an orderly, routine manner, shaped more by consistency than by command. Time in the Indus Valley Civilization was likely experienced not as something measured precisely, but as a steady flow shaped by daylight, seasons, and repeated routines that changed very little from one year to the next. Without clocks or written calendars as we know them today, people organized their days around natural cues such as sunrise, sunset, temperature, and seasonal rainfall. Morning light signaled the beginning of work, while evening brought rest and quieter activity within the home. The agricultural cycle played a central role in shaping the passage of time, as planting, tending, harvesting, and storage followed the same sequence year after year, creating a rhythm that was familiar and predictable. Seasonal flooding of rivers refreshed the soil and marked transitions between phases of work, reinforcing a long-term sense of continuity rather than urgency. Festivals or special days, if they existed, were likely modest and closely tied to natural cycles rather than to historical events or rulers. For most people, days blended gently into one another, with little distinction between one week and the next. Children grew older gradually within this rhythm, learning to recognize seasonal changes and daily patterns through repeated experience. Elder members of the community carried memories of past seasons, reinforcing expectations about what would come next, and this shared understanding reduced uncertainty. The consistency of timekeeping through nature allowed people to move calmly from task to task without pressure, as there was always another day to complete unfinished work. As life continued in the Indus Valley, this steady experience of time supported a calm and organized society where repetition provided comfort and predictability, allowing daily existence to unfold quietly and continuously, extending forward without interruption. Health and illness in the Indus Valley Civilization were likely managed through simple, practical care, rather than formal medical systems or specialized professionals, allowing well-being to remain part of ordinary daily life. People probably relied on observation, experience, and shared knowledge passed down within families to address common ailments, injuries, or discomforts. Clean water access and regular bathing may have helped reduce illness, supporting general health through routine habits rather than targeted treatment. Herbal remedies, drawn from locally available plants, may have been used quietly to ease pain or promote healing, applied in familiar ways learned through repetition rather than instruction. Rest would have played an important role in recovery, as individuals slowed their work or remained within the home until they felt able to resume daily tasks. Care for the sick was likely provided by family members, who adjusted their routines slightly while maintaining the overall rhythm of household life. There's little evidence of hospitals or dedicated healing spaces, suggesting that healthcare remained informal and integrated into domestic environments. Injuries from work or daily activity were probably common, but most would have been minor and managed without disruption. Children learned early how to care for themselves and others by watching adults respond calmly to illness or injury. Over time, these quiet practices created a shared understanding of health that emphasized balance, cleanliness, and patience rather than urgency. As days continued to pass, care for the body became another repetitive element of daily life in the Indus Valley, unfolding steadily alongside work, rest, and family routines, without drawing attention or marking clear beginnings or endings. Death in the Indus Valley Civilization appears to have been approached in a calm and practical manner, treated as a natural part of life rather than a dramatic or heavily ritualized event. Archaeological evidence suggests that people were commonly buried rather than cremated, with bodies placed carefully in graves, often accompanied by simple objects such as pottery, beads, or personal items that may have been familiar to the individual in daily life. These burial practices were generally modest and consistent, indicating that death was handled through established routines rather than elaborate ceremonies. Cemeteries were often located outside city centers, allowing daily life within the city to continue without interruption while still providing a designated space for remembrance. There is little evidence of large tombs, monumental graves, or displays of status in burial sites, suggesting that social differences were not strongly emphasized at death. The process of preparing the body, placing it in the grave, and returning to daily routines likely followed patterns that families understood and repeated over generations. Children growing up in the Indus Valley would have become familiar with these practices gradually, observing how communities responded quietly and respectfully to loss. Grief, while naturally present, was likely expressed privately within households rather than through public mourning. After burial, families would return to their routines of work, food preparation, and household care, allowing life to continue in its steady rhythm. Over time, this calm acceptance of death reinforced a sense of continuity, where the passing of one individual did not disrupt the larger flow of daily existence. As generations came and went, burial practices remained largely unchanged, becoming another quiet, repetitive element of life in the Indus Valley, unfolding steadily alongside all other aspects of daily living. The environment of the Indus Valley played a constant and shaping role in daily life, influencing how people built their cities, planned their work, and organized their routines in quiet and practical ways. The civilization developed in a region defined by rivers, plains, and seasonal weather patterns, and people learned to live alongside these natural conditions rather than attempting to control them completely. The climate was generally warm, with periods of seasonal rainfall that supported agriculture, but also required preparation and patience. Rivers provided water, fertile soil, and transportation routes, and their regular flooding refreshed farmland while also setting the pace for planting and harvesting. People adjusted their daily activities according to temperature and daylight, working more actively during cooler hours and resting when heat increased. Buildings were designed with thick brick walls, courtyards, and ventilation openings that helped manage heat naturally, reducing the need for constant adjustment. Streets were laid out to allow air to move through the city, contributing to comfort in a warm environment. Animals such as cattle, water buffalo, and goats were part of this landscape, supporting farming and transport while fitting naturally into daily routines. Seasonal changes were familiar and expected, guiding decisions about work, storage, and rest without causing urgency or disruption. Children grew up learning to recognize signs of changing weather and river behavior, absorbing environmental knowledge through observation rather than instruction. Over time, this steady interaction with land, water, and climate created a way of life that felt balanced and predictable, allowing daily existence in the Indus Valley to continue quietly, shaped by nature's rhythms as life moved calmly forward. Movement through the cities and surrounding landscapes of the Indus Valley Civilization was likely slow, familiar, and closely tied to daily necessity rather than exploration or urgency. Most people traveled on foot, moving along straight streets within cities or along well-used paths connecting neighborhoods, fields, and water sources. These routes were walked repeatedly each day, becoming deeply familiar over time, so that movement required little thought or attention. Within cities, streets were designed to be functional and orderly, allowing people to pass one another easily while carrying tools, water containers, or goods for trade. Outside the city walls, paths led toward farmland, grazing areas, and nearby settlements, following the natural contours of the land and changing very little from generation to generation. Travel beyond the immediate area occurred gradually and purposefully, often related to trade or resource gathering, and likely involved long periods of walking, resting, and waiting rather than continuous motion. Boats may have been used along rivers to transport goods and people at a calm pace, guided by the steady flow of water rather than speed. Animals, such as cattle, may have assisted with carrying loads, further slowing the rhythm of travel and integrating movement naturally into daily routines. There is little evidence of wheeled transport being widely used for everyday travel, suggesting that most movement remained simple and predictable. Children learned routes by following adults, gradually memorizing streets, paths, and landmarks through repetition rather than instruction. Over time, the act of walking itself became part of the rhythm of life, marking transitions between tasks without drawing attention. As people moved calmly through their environment each day, travel remained a quiet and necessary part of life in the Indus Valley, unfolding steadily alongside work, rest, and routine as daily existence continued forward without interruption. The everyday atmosphere of life in the Indus Valley Civilization was likely shaped as much by sound and silence as by physical surroundings, creating a calm and steady sensory environment that changed very little over time. Cities were active, but not loud in a modern sense, with sounds produced mainly by human movement, work, and nature, rather than by machines or crowds. Footsteps echoed softly along brick streets as people walked to wells, fields, or workshops, while the low sounds of conversation drifted briefly before fading away. Craftwork produced gentle, repetitive noises, such as the grinding of grain, the shaping of clay, or the tapping of tools against stone or metal, all of which blended into a quiet background rhythm. Animals added familiar sounds to daily life, with cattle moving slowly, birds calling from rooftops, and insects filling the warmer hours with a constant, gentle presence. Water flowing through wells, channels, and drainage systems created soft, continuous sounds that likely became so familiar they were barely noticed. Periods of silence would have been common, especially during the heat of the day or after sunset, when activity slowed and households retreated indoors. Evenings were likely marked by reduced movement, lower voices, and longer pauses between sounds, allowing the city to settle into stillness. Children grew up surrounded by these predictable sound patterns, learning to associate certain noises with specific tasks or times of day. Over time, this balance of quiet activity and silence became a normal and comforting part of life, reinforcing the steady rhythm of daily existence. As days continued to pass in the Indus Valley, the atmosphere remained calm and familiar, shaped by gentle sounds, long pauses, and the absence of urgency, allowing life to move forward quietly and without interruption.
Communication in the Indus Valley Civilization appears to have been practical, limited, and woven gently into everyday activities, rather than used for storytelling or public display. The civilization developed its own writing system, known today as the Indus script, which appeared most often on small seals, tablets, and objects used in trade or identification. These symbols were typically short and repetitive, suggesting that writing served functional purposes such as marking goods, recording ownership, or identifying groups, rather than conveying long messages or historical narratives. There is no clear evidence that writing was used widely for literature, laws, or personal expression, indicating that most communication likely took place through spoken language and shared understanding. Symbols carved into seals were familiar sights in daily life, handled regularly and recognized without effort by those who used them. Writing was not displayed on large monuments or public buildings, reinforcing the idea that information was exchanged quietly and locally. Most people likely communicated face-to-face, using simple speech related to work, family needs, and routine tasks, with conversations remaining brief and practical. Gestures, shared habits, and familiarity with daily routines may have reduced the need for detailed explanation, as much of life followed predictable patterns. Children learned how to communicate by observing adults, gradually picking up language and symbolic meaning through repetition rather than instruction. Over time, communication became another steady background element of daily life, functioning smoothly without drawing attention. As days passed in the Indus Valley, words, symbols, and shared understanding continued to support everyday activity in a calm and understated way, extending quietly alongside all other aspects of routine living. Communication in the Indus Valley Civilization appears to have been practical, limited, and woven gently into everyday activities rather than used for storytelling or public display. The civilization developed its own writing system, known today as the Indus script, which appeared most often on small seals, tablets, and objects used in trade or identification. These symbols were typically short and repetitive, suggesting that writing served functional purposes such as marking goods, recording ownership, or identifying groups, rather than conveying long messages or historical narratives. There is no clear evidence that writing was used widely for literature, laws, or personal expression, indicating that most communication likely took place through spoken language and shared understanding. Symbols carved into seals were familiar sights in daily life, handled regularly and recognized without effort by those who used them. Writing was not displayed on large monuments or public buildings, reinforcing the idea that information was exchanged quietly and locally. Most people likely communicated face-to-face, using simple speech related to work, family needs, and routine tasks, with conversations remaining brief and practical. Gestures, shared habits, and familiarity with daily routines may have reduced the need for detailed explanation, as much of life followed predictable patterns. Children learned how to communicate by observing adults, gradually picking up language and symbolic meaning through repetition rather than instruction. Over time, communication became another steady background element of daily life, functioning smoothly without drawing attention. As days passed in the Indus Valley, words, symbols, and shared understanding continued to support everyday activity in a calm and understated way, extending quietly alongside all other aspects of routine living. Over long periods of time, life in the Indus Valley Civilization began to change gradually, not through sudden collapse or dramatic events, but through slow shifts in environment, settlement patterns, and daily routines that unfolded quietly across generations. Archaeological evidence suggests that cities were not abandoned all at once, but rather experienced a gradual reduction in population, activity, and maintenance as people slowly adjusted to changing conditions. Rivers that once followed predictable courses may have shifted over time, altering access to water and fertile land, and these changes would have required patience and adaptation rather than immediate response. Some communities may have moved to smaller settlements or spread out into rural areas, continuing familiar farming and household practices in new locations. Urban centers became less densely populated, with fewer buildings repaired or rebuilt, allowing signs of wear to appear gradually rather than suddenly. Trade networks likely became smaller and more localized, focusing on nearby exchange instead of long-distance connections, while craft production continued at a reduced but steady pace. Daily routines would have remained largely the same for individuals, even as the broader structure of society shifted slowly around them. Families continued to prepare food, care for children, and manage households, following habits learned over a lifetime. There is little evidence of widespread violence or sudden disruption, suggesting that change occurred quietly and unevenly, varying from place to place. Children growing up during this period would have experienced life much as earlier generations had, with familiar tasks and environments shaping their days. Over time, as cities became quieter and populations dispersed, the rhythms of daily life adapted naturally, allowing the Indus Valley way of living to continue in altered forms, extending forward gradually as part of a slow and steady transition rather than a clear ending. As larger Indus Valley cities gradually became quieter and less densely populated, many people likely continued their lives in smaller settlements and rural communities, carrying familiar routines with them rather than abandoning established ways of living. These smaller settlements were often closer to fields, water sources, and grazing areas, allowing daily life to remain centered on farming, household work, and local cooperation. Homes in these areas were simpler, but followed the same practical principles as urban houses, providing shelter, storage, and space for daily activities without unnecessary complexity. Farming continued to follow seasonal rhythms, with planting, tending, and harvesting occurring in the same order year after year, guided by weather patterns and river behavior. Families remained closely connected, working together to manage food supplies, care for animals, and maintain household spaces. Craft production likely continued on a smaller scale, with tools, pottery, and textiles produced primarily for local use, rather than long-distance trade. Travel between nearby settlements remained slow and familiar, using paths that were walked repeatedly and rarely changed. Social interactions stayed local and routine, focused on shared labor and mutual support rather than organized gatherings or events. Children growing up in these rural environments experienced daily life much as previous generations had, learning through observation and repetition. Although the scale of settlement changed, the pace of life remained steady, with little distinction between one day and the next. Over time, this shift towards smaller communities allowed the Indus Valley way of living to continue quietly, adapting without disruption, as daily routines extended forward in a calm and familiar pattern that showed no clear stopping point. As life continued in smaller settlements and quieter regions of the Indus Valley, people made frequent use of what already existed, reusing tools, materials, and living spaces rather than creating entirely new ones. Bricks from older buildings may have been repurposed for new homes or repairs, and tools were maintained, sharpened, and reused until they were no longer functional. This reuse reinforced a practical approach to daily life, where familiarity and efficiency mattered more than novelty. Homes were occupied for long periods, with rooms serving the same purposes year after year, allowing residents to move through their spaces without conscious thought. Paths between homes, fields, and water sources became deeply worn through repeated use, further anchoring routines in the landscape. Daily tasks were completed at an unhurried pace, with no pressure to expand, innovate, or change established methods. People relied on experience to guide decisions, trusting practices that had worked before rather than seeking alternatives. Children learned not only how to perform tasks, but also when to perform them, absorbing the rhythm of daily life through repetition. As tools aged and spaces showed signs of wear, these changes occurred gradually and without disruption, blending naturally into the environment. The continued use of familiar objects and places created a sense of stability, even as broader social structures slowly shifted. Through this steady reuse and quiet adaptation, daily life in the Indus Valley maintained its calm continuity, extending forward in the same measured way, without urgency and without a clear endpoint. In the Indus Valley Civilization, most knowledge was passed from one person to another through habit and observation rather than written instruction, allowing learning to remain gradual, quiet, and deeply connected to daily life. Skills such as farming, tool-making, cooking, and household maintenance were learned by watching others perform the same actions repeatedly, often over many years. Children grew up surrounded by familiar routines, absorbing knowledge naturally as part of everyday experience rather than through formal teaching. Instructions were likely brief and practical, focusing on immediate tasks rather than abstract ideas, and repetition played a central role in reinforcing understanding. Because many activities followed the same patterns each day, learning required patience more than memorization, as familiarity developed slowly through continued exposure. Mistakes were likely corrected gently through demonstration rather than explanation, allowing skills to improve gradually without disruption. Seasonal knowledge, such as when to plant crops or prepare for changes in weather, was remembered through shared experience rather than recorded calendars. Elder members of the community served as living sources of memory, carrying practical knowledge shaped by years of observation and repetition. As generations passed, this quiet transmission of knowledge ensured continuity, even as settlements changed in size or structure. Learning remained embedded in routine, unfolding naturally alongside work, rest, and daily movement, allowing life in the Indus Valley to continue forward calmly, guided by habit and familiarity rather than instruction or innovation. Much of daily life in the Indus Valley Civilization was devoted not to creating new things, but to maintaining, repairing, and preserving what already existed, allowing routines to continue without interruption. Homes required regular upkeep, with walls patched, floors smoothed, and roofs maintained using familiar materials and methods passed down through experience. Tools were checked, cleaned, and repaired after use, ensuring they remained functional for repeated daily tasks. Pottery vessels were handled carefully to avoid breakage, and when damage occurred, households adapted by reusing containers for different purposes rather than discarding them. Drainage systems and water channels needed ongoing attention to remain clear, and this maintenance was likely carried out quietly and regularly as part of shared responsibility. Clothing was mended when worn, extending its usefulness rather than replacing it quickly. Paths between homes and fields were kept clear through constant use, their surfaces shaped gradually by footsteps rather than deliberate construction. These small acts of repair and maintenance did not stand out as separate activities, but blended naturally into the rhythm of everyday life. Children learned the importance of upkeep by watching adults care for tools, homes, and shared spaces, absorbing the idea that stability depended on attention rather than change. Over time, this continuous effort to maintain rather than replace created an environment where daily life could proceed smoothly with little need for adjustment. Through these quiet, repetitive acts, life in the Indus Valley continued forward steadily, supported by care, familiarity, and the ongoing work of keeping things as they were. As daylight faded in the Indus Valley, daily activity gradually slowed rather than stopping suddenly, allowing evenings to unfold in a calm and predictable way. Work in fields and workshops eased as temperatures cooled, and people returned to their homes along familiar paths without urgency. Inside houses, evening routines followed the same patterns repeated day after day, with food prepared, tools set aside, and household spaces quietly rearranged for rest. Light was limited, coming from small fires or simple oil lamps, encouraging quieter movement and reduced activity. Conversations, if they occurred, were likely brief and practical, reflecting on the day's tasks rather than planning far into the future. Children settled near family members, observing these routines as they had many times before, gradually learning when the day naturally came to a close. Washing, eating, and resting blended into one another without strict boundaries, guided by habit rather than schedules. As darkness deepened, sounds within the settlement softened, with fewer footsteps, lower voices, and longer pauses between movements. People slept on mats or low platforms, arranged in familiar spaces that changed very little from night to night. Sleep arrived naturally, shaped by physical tiredness and the absence of artificial light, rather than by deliberate planning. Each evening resembled the one before it, creating a gentle rhythm that marked the passage of time without drawing attention, allowing daily life in the Indus Valley to continue quietly forward, one day blending calmly into the next. As life in the Indus Valley continued, there was no clear moment when one day felt different from the next, and no single event that marked a final change. People simply carried on with familiar routines, waking, working, resting, and sleeping in the same steady patterns they always had. Homes remained occupied, paths remained walked, and fields continued to be tended as long as conditions allowed. Even as settlements shifted and populations slowly moved or changed, the basic structure of daily life stayed recognizable. Tools were used, repaired, and reused. Food was prepared and shared. Children grew, adults aged, and knowledge passed quietly from one person to another through habit rather than instruction. The rhythm of life did not end, but softened, adjusting gradually to new circumstances, without urgency or resistance. What mattered most was not progress or decline, but continuity, as everyday tasks carried people forward from one moment to the next in a calm and familiar way. Long after the busiest periods of Indus Valley cities had passed, what remained was not silence, but a quiet presence shaped by ordinary human activity. Brick walls stood where homes once sheltered families. Wells marked places where water had been drawn countless times. Streets showed the traces of footsteps repeated over generations. These remnants reflect a way of life focused on balance, order, and routine rather than spectacle. The people of the Indus Valley left behind no grand stories carved into stone, no dramatic accounts of conquest or rulers, but instead a record of daily living built into the structure of their cities. Their legacy rests in repetition, planning, and calm organization, offering a quiet reminder that much of human history is shaped not by extraordinary moments, but by ordinary days lived steadily over time. As you rest now, it is easy to imagine life in the Indus Valley continuing at its unhurried pace, shaped by daylight, seasons, and familiar routines. The people of this ancient civilization lived without rushing, without constant change, and without the need to record every moment. Their days flowed gently from morning to evening, from work to rest, guided by habit and environment rather than pressure. In this way, their lives mirror the quiet rhythm of rest itself. There is nothing left to follow and nothing more that needs to be remembered. The story does not need to continue because it is already settled into calm continuity. You can allow the details to fade now, letting the steady rhythm of ordinary life dissolve into quiet, as rest arrives naturally and the mind grows still.